I have done comics such as Tourist Unknown. I did that for the last 10 years, probably better known for Eve of the Ozarks, and a rebooted comic that I'm doing right now called Backwood Folk that's available at my booth. I'm also the co-host of a podcast on Ozark folklore and history called We Always Lie to Strangers, and you can find it pretty much everywhere you can find podcasts. Today, I am going to do a very casual drawing demo, so if you guys have questions at any point during it, raise a hand. I don't get disrupted easily, so. But I'm going to draw some Ozark creatures of folklore and horror and ghost stories and campfire tales, and yeah, talk about them as I draw. I hope that's what you guys are here for.
Yes.
What I can do. So I've got early pencils here started just so I can get to the inking where you guys can see a little bit more clearly immediately. But this is probably my favorite of the Arkansas cryptids. It is called the Gowrow, and it's out of the Ozarks. Most notably, there's an area called Self, Arkansas that's largely just a mailbox that it seems to have existed in some kind of hole that it tunnels out of. It is a 20-foot long lizard with tusks, spined backs, and webbed fingers. And it is known to love apples. So there would be a constant thing around apple farms and orchards that people would set up booths to see a captured Gowrow, and you would pay your nickel to see the Gowrow, and they would pull the covers off of the cage, and you would just see the hole that it tunneled away from. Classic little bit of hucksterism to sell the myth. There's stories in the Arkansas Gazette, or I believe at the time it was just the Gazette, about people hunting and sending the bones of the creature that they had caught and killed to the Smithsonian. Now, conveniently, they were lost in the mail, so take what you will. The first really place that we discovered, me and my friends that were kind of into this stuff, the story of the Gowrow was from the book We Always Lie to Strangers, which is where our podcast title came by. And it's by Vance Randolph, who's a notable Ozark folklorist.
Pissing in the snow.
Oh yeah, Pissing in the Snow. That's his collection of dirty jokes and kind of, yeah, of the Ozarks. One of the most important folklorists, really. I always draw the tusks as pig-like as possible. Maybe that's the Razorbacks' influence from being in the Ozarks, but I'm sorry I'm drawing kind of at an angle, so if this gets a little messy, my apologies. Yeah, I also, if you guys have, if this art looks familiar to you at all, it's on the poster and on all the VIP badges because I got to do all the promotional art for SpotCon this year. And again, if you guys have questions at any point, feel free to raise a hand and I'll do what I can. Relatively knowledgeable, not brilliant. That's the nice thing about folktales, we kind of make it up as you go. Now, back in the day, I used to actually do my own variant of the Gowrow, which I'm kind of doing a hybrid now of the actual kind of description of the. Yes, sorry.
I was just wondering, have you done all of the artwork for like SpotCon?
No, this is my first year. The previous, I think, 4 years were a friend of mine up in the Ozarks named Chad Mompin, Big Bot Design. Thoroughly recommend his work if you can find it. Also, I'm glad to see Matt Conover is in here in the back corner, and he has an incredible collection of prints of Ozark cryptids right now going. Correct me if I'm wrong, putting together a little field guide for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you should also stop at his booth.
There's also.
If you can tell, I'm a bit of a glutton for cross-hatching.
Yeah.
Just have to get some natural rhythms doing it a little more sideways.
Did you run across a guy named Mark Spitzer?
Yeah, he taught me in college. Yeah, he was. I actually have one of his cryptozoology books at my table.
The library's got the cryptids.
Yeah, he was a wonderful guy.
Yeah. He was way too soon.
I completely agree. Every now and then I pop on his episode of River Monsters that he was doing on Alligator Gar.
Gator cars are great.
Yeah.
I love that. The other guy casually, or
That's awesome.
he he's bleeding from something, and Mark Spitzer just casually goes, "School one for the fish."
Weirdly, with Garhole, and Gar and Alligator Gar, I actually lived with the guy that does Garhole records nowadays. That was kind of fun to see the fruition of that too, out of Northwest Arkansas. If you guys are into indie music, indie country at all.
What might be a fun thing to do is, make up some more river monsters.
I know, we need more, The buffalo doesn't really have one, and I feel like it should. I mean, there's a few giant catfish stories that you'll hear that are like man-eating catfish.
Well, those nuts that go noodling and stick their
Uh-huh.
they let the catfish bite them, so.
One of my favorite little things, when I was doing the original run of this comic in college, I would get, people would email all of their various cryptid ghost stories, and that's the best fan mail you'll ever get in your life. But there was a guy that sent me a story, a place nearby where I live, Steel Creek, had actually been one of the few places where people were fined for trying to hunt Bigfoot without a permit. Which is weird. I didn't know our area was particularly Bigfoot heavy. I thought that was much more of a, around Fowl with the Boggy Creek monster and things like that. But wherever there's woods, someone has seen a Bigfoot.
Yeah.
Generally where there's also a lot of bears. Weird how that works out.
That's what it reminds me of.
It's been a bit since I've drawn for an audience. Could be worse. My first passion growing up was ventriloquism, and I think that would have terrorized people a little bit more.
Yeah.
I remember the state fair, we used to show goats.
This is my special guest, my mother, actually, by the way.
It was after a lot of the other goat people's kids had grown up, and he was still there. And we had this little folding table, and he was teaching the littler kids how to draw cartoons.
That's funny. I could never, especially draw in front of a crowd.
I gotta keep making sure I'm still on screen. So are any of you guys out of the Ozarks, or is everybody here pretty Hot Springs based?
Yeah.
Right on. Well, love this city, and I love that you guys keep bringing me back to it. So, and I feel like you guys probably have a lot of really cool local myths and mythology with the history of this town, especially maybe some mobster ghosts.
I wish there was more though.
Yeah, we gotta get better about making new monsters, right? Like, one of the things, because for our little podcast, we're working eventually to up to an Ozark Howler episode, because we have some kind of controversial opinions on the Ozark Howler being a monster that might actually be much newer than people think. We can't find any written sources of it prior to like 95, I think. So we think it might be a much more modern cryptid. And it seems to become kind of one of the more popular ones. So people are still making new myths, or at least it seems that way. Now, we have some friends that argue that their grandparents told them about that when they were wee. People say that a lot.
How do you do your research for
I raid Dixon Street Books, which is this used bookstore in Fayetteville, and they have a Ozark section that's all these bizarre pamphlets and stuff. Like I found, and a lot of them are like self-published print runs of probably, 10 books. But like I have one on the history of fairies in the Ozarks and things like that, and like sightings. But a lot of them are just largely out of print books that you kind of have to dig up. I am not allowed to go into Dixon Street Books by myself anymore because I have spent far too much money.
Yeah. That sounds.
But I mean, who doesn't want a little library of cryptids?
How frequently do you come across something in one of those books that's new?
So actually, more from the podcast, because once you've kind of done your normal research, you kind of feel like you've exhausted your elements, but someone else with new eyes can bring in a totally different resource pool. And we found, one of the other co-hosts found the story of the Eureka baby of Eureka Springs that we had never heard of, where they uncovered what they thought was a petrified infant of a giant. And they even have a festival for it. And I've lived in the region my whole life, and I've never heard of it. So it's, sometimes it's right under your nose, too. There's the Muskogee space penguins an Oklahoma Ozarks cryptid that is it's a
Hold on.
penguin from space that are a bunch of, someone saw aliens and they were penguins
Penguin.
in yellow ski suits, basically. Again, though that one
Love
is
that.
very modern,
awesome.
as far as like, it kind of exists in the cryptid wiki, like when people make their own Wikipedias of these kind of things, so it's more in the kind of modern folklore tradition of the internet, which, you know, brings about things like Slender Man.
Do you prefer more modern cryptid stories, or do you prefer older cryptid stories?
It just depends on how good the story is for me. I love a lot, like, there's such a difference to how they happen these days, because like in kind of more classical folklore and mythology, like with Ozark specifically, I like that there's always kind of a very cryptids and monsters were met with kind of annoyance as opposed to fear. It's like, all right, the devil may show up, but I'm trying to fix this fence.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like, and I think that's, I always have such a love of that, where it's like the supernatural is just an element that you exist with, and it's just another facet of life. And I think that's a very fascinating kind of point of folklore. But I do love the modern stuff, because it's like, well, maybe I can run into it myself. You know, like, it adds that kind of immediacy to it. Switch to a brush pen, see if I can get some heavier lines.
It might be fun to do a version of the Fiji mermaid, because that's that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a story that ended up being local because of the alligator farm and that really, you know, like Ripley's Believe It or Not stuff.
Yeah, God, I bring up the Fiji mermaid as often as I can on our little podcast, because it's like one of my favorite little stories. I was the kid that, Humbug is probably my favorite X-Files episode, you know, the ones where it's all the circus, the town of circus freaks that live together and as a community. It's fun. I don't know. I have a certain appreciation for hokum, where it's like, you know, these are sometimes stories where people are trying to swindle people and tourists, you know. But I think there's kind of a fun carnival aspect to that.
I want to raise my hand because
But-
Just on the roadside attraction.
Exactly. I mean, that's really what the Eureka Baby was. It was basically a Fiji mermaid type thing. There's also some other classics, such as the White River Monster, and there's obviously the Fouke Monster, which also had its own little boom in the 70s and 80s from a film series called the Boggy Creek, films directed by Charles Pierce. He was an Arkansan director that did a lot of different Arkansas-based projects, from a movie called The Bootleggers, which most of his movies you kind of have to find on Tubi, and they look like they're a VHS rip, but you can find all the Boggy Creek movies pretty easily these days. They're a lot of fun. The second one, and I make the claim it's the most Arkansan movie of all time, in that it opens with a Hogs game at the U of A, and then cuts to Bigfoot decapitating a deer. So,
Bigfoot versus Hogzilla.
it's kind of funny that we don't have more hog-based cryptids, right?
Well, yeah. I mean,
Well, that's the one we'll make. Maybe we'll make our own cryptid eventually out of this. We just have to all swear that we're all in on it, and don't tell anyone that we made it up at SpaCon.
We can tell them we saw it.
Maybe that's how.
Yeah, there you go.
That's how, like, maybe that's how every single cryptid came along. And just like there's this group of people that's like, we're not gonna tell them.
You know, the more we do research for our podcast, it seems that might be more the case than you surmise.
Is there any type of monsters that you've heard that you actually believe in?
Interestingly, I have like, all right, I'll reveal my feelings on the supernatural. I think like I have a certain, I want to believe more than I actually believe, but like I'm very sympathetic to some of the weirder ideas of aliens being some phenomenon that we don't know, like some kind of like more like an environmental phenomenon, like ball lightning or something. But I also was a kid that carried the Mothman prophecies in my backpack to school every day. So I want to believe they're ultra-terrestrials or alternate dimension aliens, but I don't know that I believe that so much anymore. But I was a kid that was like stoked to go to the Roswell Museum. That explains who I am as a person too. So yes, getting to do a poster where they're like, hey, can you draw a bunch of aliens? Happy to.
That's awesome.
It's cool that you pay me to do it.
Oh, I'm getting paid? That's
Yeah, right.
Money.
Oh, thing with love.
I always like to give him like craggly jaws like this. But yeah, I used to do a version in my children's comic and Backward Folk as well. That was the original run of it. That was much more serpentine, and I added a touch on my own personal version of it that had a rattlesnake tail instead of the scythe, just because it felt right. Do any of you have any Bigfoot sightings or monster sightings or ghost stories?
Definitely me.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
When I was little, I lived at this one house that had a well in the backyard.
Mm-hmm.
My mom told me stories about how she had nightmares about it. And she said that one of the nightmares was something grabbed me and took me into the well, and something else came out that looked like me and wasn't me.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's like the best start of a David Lynch movie.
Yeah, I was terrified of that story growing up.
Well, that's interesting because wells are kind of a very haunted thing in Ozark storytelling. There's a creature that there's not a lot of written stuff about. I'm trying to locate more before I start playing with it in my own comics, but the Tantrobobos, which is a well-based monster that kind of whispers awful things to you.
Ooh.
And there's a lot of stories of like wells where like smoke is coming out because of like some indiscretion that happened during the Civil War or something like that, you know. And it's interesting, and I think that probably just comes down to like, you know, it's a well's kind of creepy looking just out in the woods, right?
Oh yeah.
And also just like general dangers of like, you know, corrupted water, things like that kind of probably fill into that. I myself, I have my own monster story. I have a ghost story, a monster story, and a UFO story, so I have the hat trick. But I relate to Scully more and more as an adult because I'm like, well, it's all, you know, psychology doing it. But yes.
It's kind of a heavy question, but something that I've taken interest in as I kind of get more into this aspect. But you know, with social media coming around, the ability to share more experiences, obviously things like cryptids and creatures are becoming more popularized.
Yes.
I think there's a possible negative in the fact that you have some creatures, like for example, you have Native American creatures that
there
are
is a
very not
like
honored, but
Wendigo,
there is some
effectively,
hesitation around those. Do you think that there is a negative to these things becoming more popular, or do you think it's cultural, like it's a positive that we have this cultural shared experience?
You know, I go back and forth on some of that, but I have run into a lot of problems with a lot of cryptozoology, and especially a lot of Bigfoot people love to condense every native myth into a Bigfoot, where it was actually much more of a spiritual entity or something much more abstract and ethereal. And I wish that we had more. I wish we platformed indigenous voices on these areas of folklore a little bit more than just the Bigfoot guys, right? Because like we kept running into like the Wendigo has become a Bigfoot effectively, and that's not at all really what it was. And so I don't like it when it gets flattened, I guess would be my take. I do think that folklore is maybe sometimes even the wrong term for some belief systems where it's a much more literal belief too. So, you know, I don't know the right answer on that, but like, yeah, it's something that I think is worth grappling with and considering a lot of great disparity. Some of these that I'm working on now, especially like the Gowrow, is much more like a little bit hillbilly folklore, and I feel comfortable playing in that field as a hillbilly from the Ozarks. So, you know, but yeah, I try to like make sure my T's are crossed and my I's are dotted if I deal with something that's much more kind of the indigenous belief kind of scale.
Yeah.
Just like doing your research and making sure you're not like.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everything I think is about research and making sure, and you know, never ignore the most obvious research that people do, which is asking people, you know, and talking to people that actually have the knowledge on these things.
I always think about like using the term windy boy just out of
Right.
It's kind of the terms that going around.
Yeah.
You know, where they talk about, oh, the look of it has transitioned into a more socially scary look. When you go back in indigenous history, it may not have looked anything like that.
Right. Yeah, and like, oh God, what was it? We did an episode on the Ozark Blue Man, which is another really obscure Bigfoot, and it's not.
There really are blue people.
Right. But this predates a lot of that, and it's more of a caveman, like wild man myth, and then it becomes a Bigfoot.
Yeah.
There's Smokey Joe, who's a Boy Scout camp leader that disappeared around Camp Orr, and now he's a Bigfoot. So for some reason, if there's any kind of, there's a great video I recently watched. It's like an hour, like sort of YouTube documentary. I think it's called, the channel was Trey the Explainer or something, that goes into the history of how a lot of cryptozoology kind of steals a lot from native belief. So I fully recommend it. I can't remember the name. I think it's the myth of the native Bigfoot or something like that.
Yeah.
You also run into, unfortunately, a lot of fairly, a lot of the folk horror myths of the hillbilly culture still also like try to say it was like an Indian princess or something like that. That happens a lot where it's probably not anywhere related to it at all. So you kind of, there are a lot of minds in that field, you know. Let's get that tail going.
This is more like an art thing. How do you go about doing line weight?
You know, I just try to feel it out the best of my ability. I generally start with thinner lines because then I can go back later and decide where I want the lines to have heavier weight, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
But generally for me, it's kind of a, what gives it more shape is where I try to put the lines.
So this was definitely just like some big ass alligator somebody saw, right?
I mean, or something, you know. In a lot of cases, I think people are also doing a very terrible job identifying bones and things
Or
too.
just tripping.
Well, yeah, it's like a tusked monster underground. What do you bet they were actually seeing? Probably like a dead hog or a dead
Yeah.
wild hog.
Alligators, their teeth do like, isn't alligators the ones, their teeth are the ones that like pop out, like when they're closed, their
Maybe.
teeth, or is that crocodiles? One of them have, it's like you tell them apart, I think, is their teeth are like,
More
stick
visible.
out when their mouth is closed,
Mhm.
open.
So there's another story of the Gowrow. I was mentioning Self, Arkansas as the place of it. When my fellow podcast hosts were in high school, they actually traveled out to a place where people found just a hole in the ground, and they put like a piece of metal down on a rope and threw it down to see if they could bait something out of it. And it came back, spit up out of the air like a geyser almost, and you know, it was just chewed to hell and back. And that story was like in I think the late 1800s, early 1900s or something to that effect. And so my friends tried to find Self, Arkansas. They found a mailbox, but they found no hole in the ground. So still a chance. But we always used to joke because the Ozarks are on what are called karst topography because of the limestone. So the water can seep into the water table very easily, and it creates a lot of caves and tunnels. And we always joke that was where the Gowrows were actually tunneling in, and we were mistaking the identity of what it was causing those. Writing sideways is a fun challenge.
You do your own coloring? I mean, the color is like added post.
Generally, with my actual comic work these days, it's largely drawn on a tablet and digital, so I do the colors kind of as I go. When I do colors traditionally, which I'm not doing today, unfortunately, just 'cause it's kind of messy, but is watercolors. I'm usually a big watercolor person. Just because I like to move fast when I'm drawing, and watercolors is just the best for that.
When you do the watercolor, do you do that higher, wait for it to dry and then ink, or is there like a special kind of ink that is waterproof that you use so you can do watercolor?
You can do watercolor with microns pretty easily. These pens, they're archival, so that they can be, you know, you can pretty much, they don't smear, you know. But I generally pencil first, then do watercolors, and then do inks on top of the watercolors.
Yeah.
Other people have different systems. I used to print out, like scan my inks and then print them and do the watercolors completely separately, but I find I enjoy it more when everything's on the same page more than trying to do different processes. I'm a very momentum-based artist, I think, where I kind of just need to keep going.
Do you have any tips for digital line art? Because my paper line art is fine, but
Mhm.
digital line art is where my motion goes to die, so.
I got lucky. I got one of those little Wacom, I never got the correct pronunciation, bamboo tablets at like, I don't know, 14, 15, that was like $50 or something. And I got really good at drawing digitally without thinking about it. But a lot of it, unfortunately, with digital is tools based. So like a better pen, unfortunately, does seem to be the case with those, which is the frustrating part of digital art, is there's like kind of a cost of entry.
Yeah, I just feel like I lose a lot of implied motion.
Yeah,
and it
yeah.
gets stiffer.
What program do you use? If you mind me asking?
Clip Studio.
Yeah, okay. So you're using the right program.
Yes.
So I do a lot of different layers, and I try to mix brush types to kind of help with that.
Yeah, I usually stick to one brush, that's probably my problem.
It just allows kind of different values in the line work, as far as I can tell. I also do a lot of, because I have stopped trying to make digital art not look digital, because I feel like that's kind of, well, it's like, why not just do the traditional means if you're going to use the traditional means? So I do a lot of like weird collaging elements and things like that. But I also draw on several different layers so that I can change the transparency of different elements. So it almost has like a camera focus.
Oh, cool.
So, and that I find helps like add with the value and the focus, like the ability, the field of depth, you know, where I think a lot of digital line work kind of can feel very flat because it's all on the same plane, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, that's a kind of an internal struggle, I find.
Yeah.
That's why I try to keep also one foot in the traditional, just so I don't lose that. Because it is like a bike in that you don't forget it, but you do get rusty.
What size pen are you using?
This is a 05. I usually use 5, or I usually use .005, but for a presentation where I need you guys to see, I think I was going to go for the thicker lines. I'm used to doing this at elementary schools where they have one of those projectors and they can't see anything until I'm doing ink. So I came in these pre-penciled.
You do any caricature art?
Yes, actually. I used to, every Halloween, do an open call for portraits where people could get drawn as whatever thing they wanted to do. And I had to give it up because it just physically was taxing. So I think that over the course of 5 years, I did 1,300 portraits or something to that effect. I think I've drawn a substantial portion of Fayetteville, basically, at this point.
Faces of Fayetteville.
Yeah, and their pets. I did pets and things like that. And really, the drawing part wasn't the difficulty. It's talking to, you know, hundreds of people at this, like 100 clients in 1 month is a lot, you know, like all with their own like stipulations on what they want drawn. So I kind of backed away. Also, my wrist stopped working sometimes, so I was like, this is unhealthy. So I try to make money in more solid ways, you know. Oh yeah, that was, I really wish I'd had a helper on that one. But yeah, no, I love drawing just about anything. So that's one of the things I think about being an illustrator is you don't get the ability not to know how to draw something, or you have to learn very quickly how to draw something for anybody, because the requests you get all over the map. Sometimes the coolest things, sometimes you've drawn 100 babies, and you know, I love babies, but I don't really want to draw 100 of them. But you know, it's life of an illustrator.
At least now you draw a mean baby.
Mean baby.
Oh, I had someone that wanted that commissioned me drawing their baby coming out of them like a chest burster.
At least that's interesting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Was it the dad?
You know, shockingly, it was the mom.
Oh.
She was getting it as, however, she was getting it as a present for the dad. So.
Do you have a favorite cryptid? I know it's like asking if you have a favorite child, but.
Oh, I'm a Mothman guy through and through. One of my favorite ones. There's so many aspects to that. You get UFOs, you get Men in Black, you get Bigfoots with the Mothman Point Pleasant story. So it's kind of like the best one.
It's like the all-in-one bundle.
Exactly. And I actually rewatched the Mothman Prophecies movie not that long ago. My argument might be the best X-Files movie. Just get these inks off, and this one will be done. We'll start with time. Maybe we have time for. Yeah, we got time for another monster.
What would you say would be the scariest monster tale you have ever heard?
How about Lived? Is that better?
Oh.
I was 14. I can date it because it was right when Grand Theft Auto 3 came out. And I was at my dad's house, which is out in the middle of the Newton County wilderness. And I was staying up way too late on a school night to, play this new video game that was like a different kind of video game at that point. And I hear my dad shout to go to bed. It's school night. And I get in bed, and I'm not thinking about bed. I'm not thinking about school. I'm thinking about cheat codes and like what the next mission I have to do is, and do I have to do another remote control car mission in those games? And I hear this noise, and I've never been able to adequately really describe it, other than to say it sounded like about 5 different people in harmony screaming. And I've always been kind of prone to like sleep paralysis and nightmares and things like that. So I kind of just was like, that had to be what it was. And at the time, my dad had a Rottweiler named Bruno. And I hear him on the deck of this cabin go, "Arr, arr, arr," and just scamper off. And then I hear going up the stairs. And I'm like, okay, so this is not a dream. And at the time, the cabin had a screen door, and I start hearing it swing open and shut, and I hear the door handles jiggle.
Oh.
And this goes on for, it could have been 30 seconds, it could have been 5 hours, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I'm just staring at my ceiling, just like frozen. Yeah. And eventually I hear it stamp the screen door slam one final time off the deck, pattern of 2. And then I hear Bruno the dog scamper back up the deck and bark like he had saved the day. I tell my father this in the morning, and he's like, "Oh, you heard me snoring." And I was like, I don't know.
Oh no.
To this day, I have no idea on that one. I'm largely a skeptic, so I presume it's just really advanced like sleep terrors or sleep paralysis of some sort, but it's also more fun to think there was just a monster out there.
And your dad was sleepwalking that one time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that is our Gowrow.
Nice.
Let's see, I was gonna do a blue man next. Because he's kind of a more obscure one, and it's kind of, oh wait, I have a better pencil one somewhere over here. I thought I did. Yeah, there it is. I'm sure I got this. Because it's kind of fun to draw like a sort of caveman, Bigfoot caveman combo is kind of a cool thing. Give me bushy eyebrows. I have this danger of giving all the Sasquatch type creatures and Bigfoots really nice hair, like they're almost permed. Yes?
Maybe this little forward of me, can I have your Gowrow to put on my fridge?
Maybe, we'll see. We'll see what happens at the end. Yeah, how many we get through.
I want my mom to walk in and be like, what is going on?
I do commissions. So,
oh, beautiful.
Oh, that's amazing.
Wasn't the Blue Man one of the ones that got mentioned earlier when we were talking about
This
like
would be
cryptids being
the best
flattened, like for indigenous culture?
This one's more from the hillbilly folklore. There are like someone tried to well after the fact add some elements, but the first stories of the Blue Man, actually it's out of Douglas County, I believe, are largely about this guy out living in a cave, or a monster effectively. He's a very large creature with dark hair and kind of bluish tint to his skin, and he has a big Captain Caveman club. And the person that told this story actually talked about visiting with him constantly and visiting and watching him age and his hair becoming white. But it was God, I think his name was like Saul Collins, but it's pretty early, like mostly just a kind of a small town. We don't have a Bigfoot, let's make one kind of thing. So as far as I can tell, but no, this one is more a caveman became a Bigfoot somehow, you know. But no, I think it's more in the Pacific Northwest that you run into the Bigfoots with the indigenous backgrounds. Because like I think the Fouke monster is pretty classically like came out of like stuff like In Search Of in the 70s with Leonard Nimoy more than it came out of you know, actual indigenous beliefs in the area. Though if anyone knows better and can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm happy to hear it.
Do you have a funniest cryptid story?
Oh man. This is more of a ghost story, if that's all right.
Yeah.
But like, there's a story, I believe it's Richard and Judy Dockery Young is where I discovered it in Ozark Ghost Stories, and it's called Blood in the Cellar, and it's this little boy is staying with his with his grandparents for a summer, and every night he sneaks down into the root cellar, and the first time he sneaks down there, he finds this just puddle of blood, right? And it starts bubbling and gurgling. And as it bubbles and gurgles, the sounds of the bubbles popping create a voice. And the voice says, "Tell your grandparents about me and I'll come and get you." So the kid runs up, tells his grandparents about him, said, "Oh, you're just seeing like the paste from the tomatoes that we were, canning and everything." And he just goes to bed content in that knowledge. The next day he sees fingers coming out of the puddle of blood. And they start clacking together, saying in unison as they clack, "Tell your grandparents about me and I'll come and get you." And he goes up, tells the grandparents, "Well, those are the carrots we just got," and finally there's a head with two beady eyes coming out of that pool of blood. And it says with its little rotten mouth, "Tell your grandparents about me and I'll come get you." And he goes up, tells the grandparents, "Potato, you saw the eyes and the ears of the potato," that kind of thing, the little growths on him. And he goes back one more time, and there's this giant, tall, spindly figure standing in this pool of blood. And he says, "All right, this is it. Tell your grandparents, and I'll eat you." And he goes upstairs, goes to bed, never mentions a word of it again. And that's like, to me, like kind of a lot of the Ozark folktale lessons. It's like, all right, the deal has been made. I don't need to push it,
Somebody had picked up the panels from those Al Cap cartoons.
Oh yeah, Dog Patch. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that.
And I always like schmooze.
Yeah.
We're so cool.
Well, I went to elementary and high school in Jasper, right in the shadow of Dog Patch. So a lot of my teachers were former Daisy Mays and little Abners and things like that. Yeah, it's incredible how like well known that comic was for a very long time, and it's kind of faded into lore more than anything. And largely, I think that's kind of comes about. And unfortunately, in doing research in Ozark history and Arkansas history, you discover a lot of nightmarish things too. And Al Cap is one of those people that was pretty monstrous, rather unfortunately. But they kind of defined a lot of what people think of this area.
Talented.
Yeah.
Talented and psycho.
Yeah, really.
Do you ever make up your own monsters?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Every chance I get.
What's your favorite?
That I've made of my own. I had one called the Sad Sap, which was when fall hit, or when the leaves fall off, the tree gets real sad, so the sap comes out and creates this sort of viscous creature that's just crying until it can get back in the tree.
Sad sap.
I also have, and this was in both Backward Folk and Eve of the Ozarks, a myth of an immortal goat named Hieronymus that kind of stalks the hills and terrorizes people. That's anything with a goat, because I was raised on a goat farm, I'm going to be happy about, And then in my comic, the fictional town is Podunk. It's a kind of combination of a three of the P cities of Newton and Madison County, which is Parthenon, Ponca, and Pettigrew. Yeah, right. Say it 5 times fast. And it has its own sort of Boggy Creek style monster called the Pink Eye, which is sort of a silhouetted figure that just has glowing pink eyes in the night. And in the fiction of the book, there's also, like movies were made about it in the 70s and things like that, kind of riffing on the Boggy Creek elements. Back when I did sci-fi comics, it's impossible for me to tell you which is my favorite little alien I drew, that's for sure.
Do you feel like you have a designation between, we have cryptids, we've got monsters, spirits, alien? Do you think that do cryptids need to be, like, I guess my example I can think of is that I grew up in the Dallas area, and outside of Denton, there is a bridge out there that is considered to be a haunted bridge, but the creature that is there it's been a monster, it's been a spirit, it's been a cryptid. Do you think that there's a certain designate? Do cryptids need to be non-violent to be that way? Do you think it's something that we sort of anonymously, we just kind of come up with as a community?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a very organic process, right? Where it's like, I think with a lot of these stories, it's basically people telling lies over and over and over until they become kind of factually true. With a lot of like ghost stories and stuff that feel like they're kind of, especially ones that are heavily marketed for tourism purposes. But I don't personally put too much difference. That's more just because I like them all about the same, but there's definitely differences in like how the structure of a ghost story happens than say a lot of the Bigfoot encounters. They almost all have their own narrative tropes in a way. And especially Bigfoots seem to follow certain patterns and ghosts in the area. There's a lot of haunted bridges, like you mentioned, that if you say a certain word 3 times at night, you'll see something and things like that. And I think a lot of it, and if you track some of them back, a lot of these stories, especially in the Ozarks and Appalachia, go to a lot of Scottish folktales that came from immigrants in the area. Like you have Rawhead and Bloody Bones, which is this sort of a pig monster that, not really a pig monster, it's the severed head of a pig with a bunch of different body parts that assume after someone hunts an animal they weren't supposed to, that belonged to a witch. But like, it operates on its own sort of, but if you go back, it comes from a song from Scotland, I believe, if I recall correctly. It's been a little bit since I've researched that, but it is kind of fun seeing, because some of these ghost stories do become cryptids, right? And I think it just comes down to, do people think they're a physical entity or a spiritual one, really? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and the immigration aspect really makes a lot of sense, because I remember seeing a thread one time of people talking about, does it designate something as real if you have Native Americans who saw a creature, and you also had Russian indigenous people who saw the same kind of creature that are separated by continents.
Right. Well, there's a lot of belief too, especially with like kind of wild man mythology, that a lot of that kind of has sort of shared origins, possibly. But some of that, some of it's just kind of coincidental, I think, too. But it just depends. And I think these stories travel with people too. So I mean, I think you get more folk tales of giants and things in England and in Europe, and I think that's kind of where we put our Bigfoot stories in America, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And sometimes people just attach, well, it was a ghost of a native chief or something to add that whole like idea that it's older than you think kind of thing. But a lot of these stories pretty much start and with a lot of the immigration of white people to the area, sort of, so to speak. This one's just, how much hair can I draw?
You drew it perfectly, just like you said you would.
Working on Head and Shoulders commercials and no. Oh, I'm way out of there.
Oh, Harry and the Hendersons were he gave him a bath in the swimming pool, and it was all his hair everywhere.
Is that the best Bigfoot movie? Because I think it might be.
I love it. I mean, it's an old classic, Harry and the Hendersons, and he was just such a cool, not
Well,
monster.
certainly the best looking Bigfoot that's ever
Yeah.
been in movies. It's also got John Lithgow in it, so it's gotta be pretty good.
Do you think that more like cryptid stories come out of like more populated areas or less populated areas?
I think they largely come out of less populated areas generally, where there's like more woods or wilderness in general, just because there's more hidden kind of. I mean, cities have their own versions of these things, but not. They're much. I think cities get hit more with like kind of like alligators in the sewer kind of stuff, you know. But I think that is also a folktale in and of itself. It's just an urban one. But I think they take different shapes basically. You get a lot more like lights in the sky are UFOs in a city, where they're outside of a city they might be fairies or they might be monsters. Yes?
I think that also kind of leads to the idea of, there was a lot more ghost sightings back in like the 1800s, back before electricity existed.
Right,
It was
right.
dark at night.
Yes,
Your
yes.
imagination would run wild, and I'm sure that kind of works similar if you're in a dark forest somewhere.
Right. And like, these stories are a little scarier if you don't have pictures, or the existence of cameras to be like, well, where are they? And really weirdly, I was watching something on this the other day where a lot of like the technology that people use to fake ghost photos are still double exposures. It's still the same technology that they were using in the early days of cameras to fake ghosts and things like that.
In my family, ghost stories and cryptid stories were used to kind of like keep children in check and like keep them from going in the forest at night.
Right,
Do you
right.
get, like some of those.
Kind of cautionary.
Yeah, cautionary tales.
Yeah.
Do you see those origins in?
You see it in some. I think like the Tantrabobos, the monster in the well, for instance, is
Yeah.
like trying to keep kids
Yeah.
from going near the
Yeah.
well where they might fall in. It's before Lassie, so you can't really get them out.
Our school, our playground in elementary school didn't have a fence or any boundary lines, and the school just kind of had a myth of a guy in the woods that sniped you if you went deep into the woods.
Yeah, that's funny.
That'll do it.
The modern version,
Yeah.
See a glint in your head.
The 90s fence.
I almost would have preferred something that we just had a mean bull that they stationed outside of ours.
Oh, people left for the woods. They were just playing hooky at our school. Everywhere was the woods where I was from.
We've got tickled at how many crazy horror movies. Okay, so Attack of the Killer Tomatoes.
You're speaking my
uh,
language. I dressed up as a killer tomato in like 3rd grade.
no.
For Halloween. Everyone thought I just really liked produce.
Do you think they ever made killer tomato toys?
They did, I found out later.
Everything is marketable.
Yeah, really. I think they just did a whole new, like, very special edition 4K Blu-ray, and I'm like, I don't know if this movie needs that. Feels probably better on a VHS that's been worn through,
It was probably maybe just from the meme.
The meme.
Yeah, just like see, because I think there's a certain aspect, I think I've heard about this before, where like they'll put out something for the shock factor of it, so people will buy it. So they see that it's like Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, people on the internet make memes about it, which makes people buy it, which then gets them more profit.
God, I'm trying to remember, like, because there was a Saturday morning cartoon of it too. Was it Dr. Gangrene? Is that the characters? That was the villain.
That's the scientist.
Yes, yeah. Sean Astin, Samwise Gamgee's dad, played him. I had all of those on VHS. I'm very sorry, Mom.
But it's just so goofy that you could make something, ominous and scary out of something as harmless as a tomato.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think some of the best horror comes from the most innocuous places, like where you don't expect it is where the scary stuff can really, really reside. I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of modern dark fairy tale stuff that you see with elements of that, and I think works pretty well.
I have a question on a movie that you might have watched. Have you ever seen Turkey Hollow?
I weirdly have, yeah. I watched it last Christmas.
I love that movie.
Yeah, I have a friend that he watches some of the worst movies you'll ever see, and he'll come to me with his findings, and he recommended that one, and it's got got an Arkansas native starring it with Mary Steenburgen. So, you know,
Yeah.
it's got a nice connection. But yeah, it's one of those movies I wish I'd seen as a kid, you know, because I think I would have really annoyed Mom with that one too.
I remember there was a movie I saw last year that it was a Christmas one.
Mhm.
Santa turns out he's some sort of Norse
Oh, kind of like a Odin figure.
barbarian god guy, and he ends up going to this real wealthy woman's home where her entire family's in there trying to use her up, and there's the one family that is her other kids that aren't trying to do that, including their daughter, who's still, well, she seems a little older than she should believe in Santa Claus. But
Right.
Violent Night.
Yeah, that's it. And,
Oh, I love that.
and it's
Viking
like,
Raider became Santa Claus.
and you guys, basically, I said it's Thor with reindeers.
Well, you know, some people actually tie versions of Santa Claus to Odin occasionally. Not all of them, but you know, there is precedence for that too. You know, but a lot of those kind of figures, like your Santa Clauses and things, kind of have adopted a million different origins at this point because every culture kind of translates
Right.
into their version.
Oh, Neil Gaiman, American Gods.
Yeah, right. Did a lot of work with that too.
It's kind of funny because on one end of the spectrum you got, people think that he wears red because like a Coca-Cola ad.
Right.
And then you got maybe he's related to Odin on
Right.
the other end of the spectrum.
Right. I mean, yeah, because I mean, Santa was a little bit more. It was a little bit different prior to the Coke advertisements, which I think, if I recall correctly, don't quote me on this, but like, pretty sure Coke kind of invented the modern idea, the modern visuals of Santa Claus, anyways.
I think it used to be in blue.
Green.
Somehow they're green.
Actually, Santa Claus ends up in just about every color that you can actually think of, and different cultures have, like there's Grandfather Frost from the Slavic peoples, there's I forget which one it is in Norway.
Right.
Some of those get dark, some of those make even the whole thing, and then.
Well, then you get Krampus, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
I love
Krampus is a counter.
Yeah, right.
Kind of like what has become kind of a weird, it was kind of racially twisted.
Yeah.
The original concept of black people was.
I was terrified of it.
There's some unfortunate elements of that for sure, and that is kind of a little bit of the danger of working with folklore too, is that you're still working with stories by people with their prejudices as well sometimes, but you know, do what you can.
I believe I have heard this one story about, I visited Iceland for a little bit, and there's this one story about these 12, I think it's
The
12.
Yule Lads.
Yes,
Yes.
the Yule Lads.
I actually had some friends that had been to Iceland, and they met some lifelong friends there, and they came to Arkansas for their wedding, and they stayed at my cabin with me, and we spent the entire night exchanging Ozark folklore for Icelandic folklore, and it might have been my favorite night I've ever had, because it's just like being giddy about like, the Yule Lads are great. They're like 13 little goblins almost, right? Like each one does a different annoying thing, you know, to you on the days preceding Christmas.
And correct me if I'm wrong, aren't they named like very literally?
Yes, like there's like the milk spoiler or something like that, you know. Or,
And then there's their mother, their father, and their pet cat.
yeah, right.
Oh dear God.
Whole family trees of supernatural to keep track of sometimes.
Yeah, the pet cat will kill you if you don't get clothes for Christmas.
Right. Well, this is our Ozark Blue Man. And I think that probably rounds out the amount of drawing I can do, but I'm happy to take any more questions with what remaining time we have. Yeah?
Question related to that. So is he called the Blue Man because he is blue, or does it have to do with like almost like a blue kind of?
So the version I read, which, you know, this is to say the version I read, not the only version, I'm sure, but like, I heard that his hair was like just jet black, and so in the light it kind of reflected a little blue. Almost like how people would, you know, in early comics comics, they would draw, they would color black for blue, you know, and things like that to add depth still.
Yeah.
So I presume it's something like that. But given that there's also the story of, there's a few different reasons why he was called the Blue Man, and one was also, I think, that he was considered lonely and sad, because he was, you know, living alone in this cave, and this guy was visiting him while he was aging, you know. And there's other ones. There's the Peter Bottom Cave monster, which is kind of a fun name. But like, he was one that had kids, you know, like, or there's all kinds of like the weird corner Bigfoots that are just kind of like wild men are kind of interesting. I don't know.
Do you have a least favorite cryptid? When you're like, oh, this guy.
They're all special children. You know, like, but I get a little bored of some of I only get really bored of one when it's kind of overdone. Like, I was all in for Slender Man until it just kind of got repeated over and over, which means in about 20 years I'll think Slender Man's cool again. You know, like, yeah. But like, no, it's more just the sort of repeated meme of one I get a little tired of. Like, can we see another guy? You know, and I sometimes fear Mothman flirts with that some days, and especially as people draw him more like a moth, which he doesn't look like a moth. But you know, but you can do whatever you want, you know.
The Slender Man technically originates, even though people think it was the internet that did it, it's actually a German fairy tale.
So I've heard variations
from the Black Forest.
Right. Well, there's an old woodcut that a lot of the Slender Man inspiration definitely comes from, and I think I don't know if it's originally its own creature or if it was just a representation of death, but
it was a fae that actually kidnapped small children.
Okay. So what is there's a name
There's
for
a name for it.
Yeah,
it's something
like a drogger or something like that.
No, it's literally the child wanders off into the forest, and somebody might see them wandering off with this black, clothed person, and as time changed, clothing started to change until like the early part of the 20th century.
Well, and
it was wearing a dark suit.
Right. And that's where you get kind of the crossover too between like old fairy abduction stories, alien abductions, angel visitations, like all these things kind of do correlate in the child stolen in the woods, you know. And I would, Slender Man very much fits that mold and kind of comes from that sort of corner.
And it's like also you have the black-eyed children, which technically most people think that that's a modern legend, but there is a lot more of what they refer to as the demonic children or the vampire children. Right. The same. I dabble in a lot of the
how do you not?
mythological lore.
It's boy. And what's fun about it too, or frustrating depending on your role as a researcher, is that it's how contradictory it can all get too. Because like one version of a story, this guy's got horns and the other he doesn't. You know, like
I place that more on the idea that the regional spice of more than a.
Which I like that. I mean, it's everyone gets their local variant, you know, kind of, so to speak.
It's kind of like if most people, if they really studied and looked at, let's say it's the Japanese onion, and most of the Japanese, they're fake.
Right.
You look at the nomenclature of the culture, how they looked at them. You look at the Celtic peoples, how they looked at them, how the Germanic. It's the same.
Yeah, I mean, we're all scared of the dark, right? You know, like at the end of the day. And I think that's where a lot of these come from, is like seeing the void and being like, what's in there? And we all have some base fears. Children disappearing, that's a pretty common one to have when you know, especially in a point of history where infant mortality is a lot more common.
Kind of like the evidence that it is a historical event of the Pied Piper family.
Right.
Or really did happen.
Right.
And a lot of people are going, oh, that. And then a few researchers said, no, we have the documentation right here of the event that occurred, and it was like.
A lot of stories snowball from a true story into something that we tell to scare children in a much more fantastical way. That's why I like the nature of folklore and storytelling, because at the base I think there is a truth, but it is buried in lies, you know, and maybe not lies. That's like a much meaner word than I want. It's buried an exaggeration, extrapolation, you know? And I think that's the beautiful part of it. It is the fibs that we tell ourselves, so to speak. Or, you know, for others, their beliefs. And, you know, I think it's all really cool.
There was a story I also heard from I live in Gowrow.
Mm-hmm.
There was a diver that actually, he dredged the Arkansas River.
Right.
Accidents. He dove down once, back in the late 80s, 90s, came across what he described as a catfish whose head and everything was the size of a Volkswagen.
Yeah.
And he saw the thing's mouth open.
I think I've heard of this
And
one.
he swam right back up.
Yeah.
And said, I'm never going down there again.
The best takeaway you can have, right? That's the cautionary tale in action, in reality, to a certain extent, you know?
So I've always joked, okay, so there's the Arkansas River catfish. Why the heck isn't this like being played up in mythology?
Because there's the Monster of the Hole, I think it was another Richard and Judy Dockery story about a witch that was like warning tourists not to swim in the swimming hole, and then they did it, and there was a giant catfish that gobbled them up, you know, like, but it's not very well known, and I don't know why, because it's such a regionally specific animal that, like, it seems like and catfish are so fun to draw, so I don't know, I can't
Catfish get huge in the down.
Yeah.
Talking about, it was near the, sorry, my brain's going a little.
It's all right, I've been here all weekend, I feel it.
The dam.
Yeah.
It was at the base of the dam.
Right.
Which scientists have actually proven bottom feeder fish that are at the base of the dam
I think.
get abnormally large.
Yep. Okay, yeah, I gotta cut.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, but I'll be at my booth if you wanna
Okay.
continue chatting.